The colonel's mood changed abruptly. "Alexander Bronislavovich, I have long known you as an experienced fighting officer, but you also know me, don't you? So no hard feelings, then? Resentment at such a time would be inappropriate. Please forget the fact that I spoke so harshly to you. But then, you also—" Studzinski's face flooded with colour. "Yes, Colonel. I'm sorry." "Well, excellent then. Let's not waste any more time, otherwise the men will lose the will to fight. Everything will depend on what happens tomorrow, when it will all have become clearer. But I'll just say this for now. Don't bother with the mortars at all tomorrow. There won't be any horses or shells. Instead, you are to start by concentrating on their rifle drill, shooting and more shooting. Ensure that by midday tomorrow the battalion is capable of shooting as well as any top-class regiment. And all experienced cadets are to be given grenades. Understood?" Deep shadows crossed Studzinski's forehead. He had been listening carefully to everything the colonel had been saying. "May I ask you a question, sir?" "I know what you want to ask me, and no, you may not. But I'll answer it anyway. The situation's terrible. It has been worse, but rarely as bad as this. Now do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "So then," the colonel said, his voice considerably lower, "you understand why I don't want anybody to spend a night in this stone death trap at such a dangerous time, and I certainly don't want to be responsible for the deaths of 200 young men, 120 of whom don't even know how to use a rifle." Studzinski said nothing in reply. "Right then. We'll deal with the rest this evening. There'll be enough time. Let's go and have a look at the battalion." They went into the assembly hall. "Officers, attention!" bawled Studzinski. "Good day, gentlemen." From behind Malishev's back, Studzinski gestured at the men like an anxious theatre director, and the grey, bristling ranks responded with such a roar of greeting that the windows shook. Malishev gave the ranks a cheerful once-over and brought his hand down from the salute. "Splendid! Gentlemen," he said, "I will not waste any words. I am not a great public speaker, as I am not in the habit of addressing meetings, and therefore I will be brief. We will be hitting that son of a bitch Petliura where it hurts, and you may rest assured we will beat him. Among you are graduates from the Vladimir, Konstantin, and Alexeyevsky military academies, and not once has any of you fine fellows from these academies ever brought disgrace on their institutions, and there are many present who were students of this famous school. Its ancient walls are looking down on you, and I trust you will not do anything to make them ashamed of you. Gentlemen of the Mortar Battalion, we shall defend this great city from the besieging marauders. We simply need to start firing at this wonderful so-called president with our 6-inch guns, and all he'll have to show for it will be a pair of dirty underpants. God rot his slimy soul." Encouraged by the colonel's cheerful humour, the bristling, dense ranks responded with a roar of laughter. "Gentlemen, do your best." Once again, as if from the wings, there was a theatrical gesture from Studzinski, and once again the ranks responded with a roar that disturbed several layers of dust as they raised 3 cheers for their commanding officer. 10 minutes later, the assembly hall, just as on the battlefield at Borodino, was dotted with hundreds of weapons in stacks. 2 sentries stood in the shadows at either end of the dusty parquet floor, guarding the forest of bayonets. Somewhere far off down below came the hasty clatter of footsteps as the men following their orders dispersed. Officers could be heard shouting in the corridors, accompanied by the rumble and metallic clatter of feet. Studzinski was himself posting the sentries. Then, suddenly, again in the corridors came the sound of a bugle call flooding through the entire school. If there was any note of anxiety in the sound, it was unconvincing, and the halting, broken nature of the playing indicated that it was not warning of any real danger. In the corridor above the landing, bounded by the double staircase leading to the vestibule, a cadet was standing, puffing out his cheeks. Faded ribbons of the Order of St. George dangled down from the tarnished brass instrument. Mishlaevsky, his feet spread wide apart like a pair of compasses, stood in front of the bugler, instructing and testing him. "Not so hard. No, like this. Blow out, like a bellows. That old thing's not been played for ages. How about the general alarm? Ta-ta-tam, ta-tam, went the bugler, spreading alarm and despondency among the rats. The light in the assembly hall was fading rapidly. Malyshev and Alexei Turbin stood among the stacks of rifles. Malyshev gave Turbin a rather suspicious look at first, but then a welcoming smile spread over his face. "Well, Doctor, how are things going? Everything all right in the medical section?" "Yes, sir." "In that case, Doctor, you can go home, and you can tell the medical orderlies they can go too, but tell them that they must be here at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning along with the others. As for you—" Here Malyshev paused for a moment, concentrated in thought. "As for you, I would like you to be here tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Until then, you are free." Malyshev again thought for a moment. "And you know what? Don't wear your epaulets for the time being." Looking a little embarrassed, he continued, "Our plans won't get very far if we draw attention to ourselves. So then, here tomorrow at 2 o'clock. "Yes, sir." Turbin shuffled his feet. Malyshev took out his cigarette case and offered him a cigarette. In response, Turbin lit a match. 2 red pinpoints started to glow, clearly indicating just how dark it had become. Malyshev glanced anxiously up at the dully shining arc lights on the ceiling, then went out into the corridor. "Lieutenant Mishlaevsky, please come here for a moment," he called. "I would like you to be in total charge of the electric lighting. Ensure that the building is fully lit as soon as possible. Be so good as to ensure that you have such control over the lighting that you are able not only to turn it on everywhere, but also to turn it off. You have complete responsibility for the building's lighting arrangements." Mishlaevsky saluted and turned abruptly on his heels. There was a final squeak from the bugle. Mishlaevsky, his spurs jingling, clattered down the main staircase so rapidly that he could have been on skates. A moment later, and the thunderous sound of hammering fists and yelled commands could be heard coming up from somewhere in the depths of the building. This was followed by a sudden blaze of light in the main entranceway downstairs that led into the vestibule, dimly illuminating the portrait of the Tsar Alexander. His eyes shining with pleasure, Malyshev turned to Turbin. "There's a real officer for you, damn it! Did you see that?" At that moment, a small figure appeared on the staircase, slowly climbing the steps. When it reached the first landing, Malyshev and Turbin, hanging over the banisters, could see it more clearly. The figure was moving with feeble, tottering steps, shaking his white head. He was wearing a wide, double-breasted jacket with silver buttons and green lapels, and holding an enormous key in his shaking hands. Mishlaevsky followed him up the stairs, exhorting him every so often. "Come on, old fellow, look lively. Stop crawling along like some slow-witted beetle." You're... spluttered the old man as he shuffled up the stairs. Suddenly, Karas dived out of the gloom on the landing, followed by another taller officer, then 2 cadets, and finally the pointed snout of a machine gun. Horrified, the old man stumbled, then bent down and bowed to the waist before the machine gun. "Your Excellency," he mumbled. With trembling fingers, the old man poked around in the semi-gloom and opened an oblong box on the wall to reveal a white spot of light shining inside. He placed his hand inside the box. There was a click, and suddenly the whole upper area of the vestibule, the entrance to the assembly hall, and the corridor were flooded with light. The darkness turned and fled into the distance as far as it could go. Mishlaevsky immediately seized hold of the key and, placing his hand in the box, began to experiment, clicking and pulling the black switches. The light, so dazzling that it appeared pink, now came on, now vanished again. The globe lights in the assembly hall flared up and then went out. Soon 2 lights at the end of the corridor went on, and the darkness, somersaulting, disappeared for good. "How's that down below?" shouted Mishlaevsky. "No, off," someone replied from the vestibule. "Wait, it's on again." After many attempts, Mishlaevsky finally succeeded in turning on the light in the assembly hall, the corridor, and over the Alexander painting. He locked the box and put the key in his pocket. "Off you go now and have a sleep, old fellow," Mishlaevsky said soothingly. "Everything's fine now." The old man's short-sighted eyes blinked nervously. "But what about the key, Your Excellency? The key? Will you keep hold of the key?" Yes, that is exactly what I intend to do. Keep hold of the key." Still trembling, the old man slowly began to leave. "Cadet!" A stout, red-faced cadet snapped to attention by the box and stood motionless. "Unhindered access to the switch box is to be permitted to the battalion commander, the senior officer, and myself, but to nobody else. In the case of an emergency, and if ordered by one of those 3 officers, you may break open the box. But whatever happens, make sure you don't damage the switchboard." "Yes, sir." Mishlaevsky approached Alexei Turbin and whispered, "Did you see Maxim?" "My God, yes, I did," came Turbin's whispered reply. The battalion commander stood by the entrance to the assembly hall, 1,000 lights playing on the silver edge of his sabre. He called Mishlaevsky over to him and said, "So, Lieutenant, I'm so glad you've joined us. Good man." "Pleased to be of service, Colonel." "All that's left for you now is to sort out the heating here in the assembly hall for the cadets on shift duty, and I'll take care of the rest. I'll make sure you have something to eat and some vodka. Not much, but enough to keep you warm." Mishlaevsky smiled charmingly at the colonel and cleared his throat appreciatively. But Turbin didn't listen to any more of their conversation. Leaning over the banister, he did not take his eyes off the white-haired figure until it disappeared out of sight. He was overcome by a feeling of emptiness and sadness. As he stood there, leaning on the cold banister, he remembered a particular event with especial clarity. A crowd of students of all ages was streaming excitedly along this very same corridor. Maxim, the thick-set school beadle, grabbed at 2 small, dark figures in the front of the crowd. "Well, well, well," he mumbled. "The school inspector will be so pleased at the opportunity to feast his eyes upon Mr. Turbin and Mr. Mishlaevsky, particularly on the occasion of the school patron's visit. He will be so pleased, so extraordinarily pleased." These words of Maxim, it has to be said, were shot through with malicious irony. Only someone with the most perverted of tastes could have derived any pleasure from the sight presented by Messrs. Turbin and Mishlaevsky, particularly on the joyous occasion of the school patron's visit. Mr. Mishlaevsky, firmly grasped by Maxim's left hand, had a split upper lip, and his left sleeve was hanging by a thread. And Mr. Turbin, gripped by Maxim's other hand, had lost his belt, and not only all his shirt buttons, but also all his fly buttons had flown off, exposing his body and underclothes in the most scandalous way to anybody who cared to take a look. "Let go of us, please, Maxim, be a good chap," implored Turbin and Mishlaevsky, looking up at Maxim, all expression draining from their blood-stained faces. "That's it, Max! That's wonderful! Give him what for!" the boys behind them shouted excitedly. "He can't be allowed to get away with beating up his juniors." Oh my God, what a day that was! Such sunshine, such a racket, such noise! Maxim then was quite different from the way he looked today, white-haired, melancholy and impoverished. His hair then was black and bristly, with only a few strands of grey showing through. He had metal claws rather than hands, and a medallion the size of a carriage wheel hung round his neck. Ah yes, the wheel, rolling on from village B, making n number of revolutions, only to arrive, finally, at a stony void. God, it's so cold. We must defend now. But what, exactly? Emptiness? The hollow sound of footsteps? Oh, Alexander, will you really be able to save the dying building with your Borodino regiments? Come on, come to life, and bring them all down from the canvas. They'd defeat Petliura. Turbin's legs carried him downstairs of their own accord. "Maxim!" he wanted to shout, but then he slowed down and stopped altogether. He imagined Maxim downstairs in the basement apartment where the caretakers lived. No doubt he would have forgotten everything by now, and he would be sitting by the stove, trembling and crying. But Turbin was depressed enough, without worrying about that. Enough of this stupid sentimentality. Everyone had wasted their lives being too sentimental. Enough. And yet, when Turbin had dismissed the medical orderlies, he found himself in an empty, dimly lit classroom, with blackboards looking down from the walls and desks standing in rows. Unable to restrain himself, he opened the lid of one of the desks and sat down. Everything felt so difficult, awkward and uncomfortable. The blackboard was too close for comfort. Yes, he could swear this was the classroom, or perhaps the one next door. The exact same view of the city from the window. Over there towered the lifeless mass of the university building. And yes, there was the boulevard, as straight as an arrow, lined with lamplight, the box-like houses interspersed with dark gaps, the walls, the sky rising to infinity. And outside, it was like a performance of the opera Christmas Eve, with the snow and the lights dancing and twinkling. I really would like to know what the shooting's about at Sviatoshin. It all sounded pretty harmless and distant, as if they were firing through cotton wool. Boom, boom. That's enough, Turbins said to himself, and closed the desk lid. He went out into the corridor, past the sentries, and through the vestibule out into the street. A machine gun was standing in the front entrance. The street was practically empty of pedestrians, and thick snow was falling. That night, the colonel was very busy. He made a large number of trips from the school to Madame Anjou's boutique just a stone's throw away, and back again. By midnight, everything was operating well and at full stretch. Hissing faintly, the arc lamps were bathing the school in a pinkish glow. The assembly hall had warmed up considerably. All evening the fires had been raging in the ancient stoves in the library alcoves along the sides of the main hall. On Mishlaevsky's orders, the cadets had been stoking the stoves with copies of the literary journals, Notes of the Fatherland, and Library for Reading for the year 1863. Later, throughout the night, they had used old school desks, chopping them up to the clatter of axes. With 2 glasses of vodka inside them, the colonel had kept his promise and provided half a bucket of the stuff, enough to warm them up. Studzinski and Mishlaevsky each kept 2 hourly shifts throughout the night, taking turns to sleep on greatcoats alongside the cadets by the stove, the shadows and red glow from the fire playing on their faces. Then they would get up and check the sentry posts. Karas, together with a group of cadets manning machine guns, kept watch by the garden exits, while 4 cadets wearing sheepskin coats stood guard an hour at a time over the wide-barreled mortars. At Madame Anjou's, the stove crackled away merrily, with the flues ringing and roaring. One of the cadets was standing guard by the exit, never taking his eyes off the motorcycle standing just outside in the street, while 5 cadets slept the sleep of the dead, having spread their greatcoats out on the floor of the shop. By 1 o'clock, the colonel had finally been able to settle down at Madame Anjou's. Even then, however, he did not go to bed, but was constantly on the telephone, yawning all the time. And then, at 2 o'clock in the morning, a motorcycle roared up to the shop, and a military man in a grey coat climbed out. "Let him through. It's for me," the colonel said. The man handed the colonel a bulky package wrapped in a sheet and tied both ways with string. The colonel personally placed it in the little safe at the end of the shop and locked it with a padlock. The man in the greatcoat sped off on his motorbike, while the colonel went up to the gallery, where, spreading his coat out on the floor and placing under his head a pile of rags, he lay down. After ordering the cadet on duty to wake him at exactly 6:30, he fell asleep. Chapter 7. Pitch-black night had descended on the terraces of the finest spot on earth, Vladimir Hill, whose brick paths and alleyways were hidden under an endless downy mantle of virgin snow. No inhabitant of the city ever sets foot on that huge terraced prominence in the winter-time. And indeed, who would venture onto it at night, especially at such a time? It is simply a horrendous place. It's no place even for the brave. And in any case, there is nothing to do there. There is just one part that is lit. For 100 years now, the dark metallic figure of St. Vladimir has been standing on his awe-inspiring massive plinth, holding in his outstretched hand an 18-foot-high cross. Every evening, as soon as the snowdrifts, slopes, and terraces become enveloped in twilight, the cross lights up, continuing to shine throughout the night. The light is visible for some 30 miles, as far as the dark, distant plains stretching away in the direction of Moscow. But on the hillside itself, very little is illuminated, just a feeble white light falling onto the dark green plinth and picking out of the darkness the balustrade and a section of the railing bordering the middle terrace. And that is all. Go just a little distance away, and you'll find nothing but total darkness. The snow-capped trees have a strange appearance, like chandeliers wrapped in muslin, and you would sink up to your neck in the snowdrifts. Quite terrifying. So you can understand why no one, even the most daring, should want to go there, mainly because there would be no point. But the city is a different matter. A night of alarm, of military activity, the street lamps shining like strings of beads. The Germans are asleep, but they're sleeping with half-closed eyes. In the darkest alleyway, a blue cone of light suddenly erupts into life. Halt! Crunch, crunch, the sound of pawns in their basin-like helmets marching along in the middle of the street, black ear mufflers. Crunch, rifles not on shoulders, but held at the ready. There's no fooling about with Germans, at least not now. Whatever you might think, Germans have to be taken seriously. They're like dung beetles. Documents! Halt! A beam of torchlight pierces the dark. Hey there, you! A large, black, shiny car with 4 headlights, clearly no ordinary car, for this gleaming carriage is being escorted by 8 mounted troopers, proceeding at a leisurely trot. But the Germans remain indifferent to this, and shout at the car. Halt! Your name! Where are you going, and why? General of Cavalry Belorukov, Commander-in-Chief. Now that was quite different, of course. Please, General, proceed. A pale moustached face behind the glass in the depths of the car. The faint glimmer of a general's insignia on his coat, and the German basin-like helmets saluted. Deep down inside, it is true, they actually couldn't care less whether it was General Belorukov or Petliura or some Zulu chief in this lousy country. But still, when in Zululand, do as the Zulus do. So the helmets saluted. Diplomatic courtesies, as the saying goes. A night of military activity. Light streams through the windows of Madame Anjou's boutique, illuminating ladies' hats, corsets, ladies' drawers, and Sevastopol cannon. The cadet on duty marches backwards and forwards like a pendulum, shivering from the cold, tracing the imperial monogram in the snow with his bayonet. And over there, in the Alexandrovsky High School, the assembly hall is lit up like a ballroom. Mishlaevsky, fortified by a sufficient quantity of vodka, is constantly on the move, glancing up at the portrait of Tsar Alexander the Blessed as he makes his way to check the switchbox. The general mood in the school is cheerful, but at the same time, serious. The building is being guarded by 8 machine guns, and cadets, no, not students, but cadets. They'll fight all right. Mishlaevsky's eyes are red, like a rabbit's. True, he won't get much sleep tonight, but he's had plenty of vodka, and there's a fair amount of tension to deal with. For the time being, things weren't too difficult in the city. If you're someone with a clear conscience, that's fine. Please go on your way. You'll be stopped about 5 times, of course, but if you have your documents with you, then please, you're free to go. It's surprising you're out at night at all, but please, on your way. But who would climb Vladimir Hill at this time? Absolute madness. Particularly with the wind howling through the snowdrifts like banshees from hell, as it does in that part of the world. If anyone were to climb the hill, then it could only be some totally desperate outcast who, in any regime on earth, would feel like a wolf in a pack of dogs. Utterly miserable, like one of Victor Hugo's characters. He would be the sort of person who should not show his face in the city, and if he were to dare show his face, it would be totally at his own risk. Should you manage to evade the patrols, then you've been lucky. But if not, you've only yourself to blame. If such a person were to find his way onto the hill, then he truly deserves our every sympathy. You wouldn't wish it even on a dog. The wind is icy. Just 5 minutes in such a wind, and you'll wish you were safe at home. And yet, 5 hours out here, and my God, we'll freeze to death. The trouble was that you couldn't reach the upper city by going past the lookout point and the water tower, because Prince Belarukov's headquarters, you understand, were situated in the monastery building in Mikhailovskaya Street, and you were in constant danger of coming across a military convoy, or armoured cars, or... Officers, damn it! Blast them to hell! Patrols, patrols, and more patrols. And there was absolutely no point in thinking you might be able to get down to the lower city, to Podol, via the hillside terraces. Firstly, because of the tightly spaced street lamps on Alexandrovskaya Street, winding its way round the foot of Vladimir Hill, and secondly, because of the Germans, damn them. One patrol after another. But what if you tried just before dawn? You'd freeze to death in no time. And as the icy wind whistled along the alleyways, you imagined you could hear the murmur of voices in the snowdrifts by the railing. "We'll freeze to death, Kirpati." "Just be patient, Nemolyaka. The patrols will carry on till daylight, then they'll pack it in and go to bed. We'll slip through to the embankment and stay at Sichika's for a bit of warmth." 3 dark shadows seemed to materialize out of the blackness and started moving along close to the railing, leaning over it to look down onto Alexandrovskaya Street immediately below. The street looked empty and silent, but at any moment 2 blue-white cones of light might appear, and German armoured cars would come speeding along the street, or the sharply defined dark shadows of German troops in their steel helmets. And everything was so close. One of the shadows on Vladimir Hill detached itself from the others. "Hey, Nemolyaka," he hissed through his teeth. "Let's risk it and go. We may be able to slip through." No, things are not right on Vladimir Hill. And believe it or not, things that night weren't going too well at the Hetman's palace either. Something rather unusual and unseemly was happening. An elderly footman with sideboards scurried like a mouse across the gleaming parquet floor of a large room furnished with dowdy gilt chairs. A distant electric bell rang fitfully, accompanied by the jingle of spurs. In one of the bedrooms, the mirrors with tarnished crown-topped frames reflected a strange, unnatural picture. A thin, greying, foxy individual with a clean-shaven face as white as parchment and a clipped moustache was pacing up and down in front of the mirrors. He was wearing an expensive Circassian coat with ornamental silver cartridge cases. 3 German and 2 Russian officers were hovering nearby. One of the Russians was in a Circassian coat, like the foxy man in front of the mirrors, while the other was wearing a military jacket and riding breeches, clearly indicating he was a cavalryman, although he was also sporting Hetmanite wedge-shaped epaulets. They had been helping the foxy man change his clothes. This process had entailed helping him put on his Circassian coat, a pair of broad-bottomed trousers, and patent leather boots. He was now wearing the uniform of a typical German major, and as such he looked no better and no worse than hundreds of similar German majors. Then the door opened, and the dusty palace curtains parted to admit another man wearing the uniform of a doctor in the German army and carrying a large number of packets. He opened the packets, and with clinically deft movements bandaged the head of the newly born German major in such a way that all that remained visible was the latter's foxy right eye and thin lips, which were half open to reveal a number of gold and platinum-capped teeth. These unseemly goings-on at the palace continued for a little while. On his way out, the doctor, speaking in German, told the group of officers who were lounging about in the room with the dowdy gilt chairs as well as in the neighbouring room that Major von Schratt had accidentally wounded himself in the neck while unloading his revolver, and that he needed to be taken to the German military hospital as a matter of urgency. A telephone rang somewhere, followed by a bird-like tweet from a second telephone. Then a German ambulance with Red Cross markings drove silently through the wrought-iron gates and drew up at the side entrance. Swathed in bandages and wrapped from head to foot in his greatcoat, the mysterious Major von Schratt was carried out on a stretcher. The ambulance's side door slid open, and he was placed inside. The ambulance drove off with a muffled roar and turned out of the palace gates. Meanwhile, in the palace itself, the commotion continued right through until the morning. The lights continued to burn in the portrait galleries, and in the gilded halls telephones rang, and the servants' faces began to adopt an expression that was little short of insolent, their eyes lighting up to show their amusement at the whole business. In a cramped little room on the ground floor of the palace, a man wearing the uniform of a colonel in the artillery regiment was standing by the telephone. Before lifting the receiver, he first carefully closed the door of the small, whitewashed communications room, a room that was totally unlike any other room in the palace. He asked the unsleeping operator at the exchange to connect him with telephone number 212. Obtaining the number, he said merci, and frowning with anxiety, asked in a soft, confidential tone, "Is that the headquarters of the mortar battalion?" Alas, alas! Despite his best intentions, Colonel Malyshev was not able to sleep through until 6:30 the following morning. At 4 a.m., the little bird at Madame Anjou's started tweeting with extraordinary persistence, and the cadet on duty was forced to wake the colonel. The colonel awoke with astonishing speed, his brain getting into gear and operating at full stretch immediately, as if he hadn't been to sleep at all. The colonel, furthermore, wasn't angry with the cadet for interrupting his sleep. A little after 4, he was whisked away somewhere by the motorcycle, and by 5 o'clock, when he returned to Madame Anjou's, he was frowning with anxiety, his expression exactly like that of the other colonel who had telephoned the mortar battalion from the palace communications room. At 7 o'clock the next morning, the very same extended file of men who had marched up the staircase towards the portrait of Tsar Alexander the previous evening stood by the battlefield of Borodino, illuminated in a rosy light. Huddled together from the pre-dawn cold, they were grumbling and muttering among themselves. Staff Captain Studzinski stood among the group of officers, a little apart from his men, and strange as it may sound, his eyes reflected exactly the same anxious expression as those of Colonel Malyshev 4 hours earlier. But anybody who might have seen both the colonel and the staff captain during that notorious night would definitely have been able to tell the difference between them. Studzinski's expression was one of anxiety about the future, whereas Malyshev's was one of certainty that he knew and understood exactly what the future held in store for them. Sticking out from the sleeve of Studzinski's greatcoat was a long list of the names of the men in his battalion. Having just taken the roll call, he was now certain that the unit was 20 men short. This would explain why the list was crumpled and bore the marks of his fingers all over it. The air was thick with smoke from the officers' cigarettes. At precisely 7 o'clock, to the minute, Colonel Malyshev appeared before the assembled men, to be greeted as he had been during the evening before by a roar of welcome. And just like the previous evening, the colonel's silver sabre was belted on his waist, except that this time, for some reason, its silver blade was not reflected 1,000 times by the light. A revolver in its holster hung on his right hip. The holster was unbuttoned, the result, no doubt, of Colonel Malyshev's uncharacteristically agitated state of mind. The colonel stepped out in front of his men, his gloved left hand placed on the hilt of his sword, and his uncovered right hand fingering his holster. He began to speak as follows. "I would ask the officers and men of the mortar battalion to listen carefully to what I am about to say. During the course of the night, there have been marked and sudden changes affecting our position as a battalion, the wider position of the army, and I would say the overall political position of the Ukraine. As a result, I am announcing the disbandment of the battalion. I would consequently like each of you to remove all insignia from your uniforms, to take from the armaments store anything you're able to carry and that you might require, and then to disperse to your own homes, where you are to lie concealed, without giving yourselves away, and await a further summons from me." He fell silent for a moment, thereby underscoring even further the absolute and utter silence that filled the assembly hall. Even the lamps ceased their hissing. Everybody, officers and men, had their eyes fixed on one thing in the room, the colonel's clipped moustache. "Such a summons," he continued, "will follow as soon as there is any change in the position. But the chances of this happening, I have to say, are slim. I myself have no idea how everything will work out, but I think that the best that can be expected by by the best, the colonel said with sudden emphasis, among you, is that you will be sent to join the forces on the Don. I therefore order the entire battalion, with the exception of those officers and cadets who have been guarding the building overnight, to disperse to their homes immediately." "What's this? What's this?" The entire body of men started whispering incredulously, and the forest of bayonets seemed to dip and wilt. Among many there was a look of utter bewilderment, but among some others, one of apparent jubilation. Staff Captain Studzinski, his eyes askance and his face a bluish-pale colour, detached himself from the group of officers and took several steps towards Colonel Malyshev. Then he stopped and glanced round at the officers. But rather than look at the staff captain, Myshlaevsky kept his eyes firmly fixed on Colonel Malyshev's moustache, his expression indicating, as was his wont, that he wanted nothing better than to utter a whole string of obscenities. Karas just stood there blinking absurdly, his arms akimbo, while a separate group of young ensigns could be heard whispering one damning, alarming word: "Arrest." "What's this? What are they saying?" said somebody in a bass voice among the ranks of cadets. "Arrest." "Treachery." As if taking inspiration from the light overhead, Studzinski suddenly looked up. Then he glanced quickly down at the butt of his holster and shouted, "Number 1 platoon!" The front rank broke up, and several grey figures detached themselves from it. A weirdly confused scene followed. "Colonel," Studzinski said, his voice totally hoarse, "you are under arrest." "Arrest him!" one of the ensigns suddenly shouted hysterically, stepping out towards the colonel. "Wait, gentlemen," shouted Karas unhurriedly, sizing up the situation. Myshlaevsky leapt briskly out of the group of officers, seized the impulsive ensign by the sleeve of his greatcoat, and tugged him back. "Let go of me, Lieutenant!" the ensign snarled, his mouth twisted with rage. "Be quiet!" the colonel shouted in an unusually assured voice. His mouth, it is true, was no less twisted than the ensign's, and his face had gone red and blotchy, but the expression in his eyes was more assured than was the case with any of the officers. And everybody stood still. "Quiet!" the colonel repeated. "I order you to stay still and listen to me." There was now absolute silence in the hall, and Myshlaevsky immediately looked alarmed. It was as if a light had suddenly been switched on in his head, and he was waiting for the colonel to say something that would prove to be of greater import and interest than anything he had said earlier. "So then," the colonel said, his cheek twitching. "Right. So then. I can see now exactly how fortunate I would have been if I had gone into battle with the unit that the Lord God has seen fit to provide me with. Really fortunate. But although it might be possible to forgive such behaviour in the case of a student volunteer, or a young cadet, or perhaps even an ensign in extreme circumstances, this would be totally out of the question in your case, Staff Captain." As he said this, the colonel gave Studzinski a piercing look of quite exceptional hostility, his eyes flashing with genuine irritation. Once again the room fell silent. "Right then," the colonel continued. "I have never in my life participated in a rally until now, but it looks as if I shall have to do so. All right then, let's have a debate. Your attempt to arrest your commanding officer shows you to be good patriot, but it also reveals your, how can I put it, inexperience as officers. To put it briefly, I don't have the time to waste, and I can assure you," the colonel emphasized with menacing significance, "neither have you. Now let me put a question to you. Who is it you wish to defend?" Silence. "I'm asking you, who is it you wish to defend?" Myshlaevsky, burning with interest and curiosity, stepped forward from the rest, saluted, and said, "It is our duty to defend the hetman, Colonel." "The hetman, you say?" responded the colonel. "Excellent. Battalion, attention!" he bawled suddenly with such force that the squadron instinctively shuddered. "Well, listen to this. Earlier this morning at about 4 o'clock, the hetman fled the city, thereby shamefully abandoning us to our fate. Just ran away, like a total blackguard and coward. And an hour later, the hetman was joined by our army commander, General of Cavalry Byelorukov. both of them heading for a German train that was waiting for them. And within a few hours at most, we will be witnesses to a catastrophe in which people such as yourselves, hoodwinked and embroiled in a venture not of your own choosing, will be slaughtered like cattle. Listen, Petliura is now drawing close to the city with an army of more than 100,000 men, and tomorrow— Wait, what am I talking about? Not tomorrow, but today. Here the colonel pointed out of the window, indicating where the sky over the city was already beginning to turn blue. Scattered and broken units of unfortunate officers and cadets, abandoned by staff officer bastards and those two scoundrels who deserve only to be hanged, will come up against Petliura's well-armed troops, who will outnumber them by 20 to 1. Listen, my children! Colonel Malyshev suddenly shouted, his voice breaking. Although he used the term "my children" to address the massed ranks standing in front of him with their bayonets fixed, the colonel himself was actually more of an age to be their older brother rather than their father. Listen, as Staff Captain Studzinski will testify, I am an officer in the regular army who fought against the Germans throughout the war, and I am informing you that the responsibility for everything is mine and mine alone. It is on my conscience. I am sending you home. Do you understand? He shouted. Yes, they all answered, their bayonets swaying. Then one of the cadets in the second rank broke into a fit of loud, convulsive weeping. Totally unexpectedly for the entire battalion, and no doubt for himself, Staff Captain Studzinski, in a gesture not fully befitting an officer, covered his eyes with his hands, allowing the list of names to fall on the floor, and burst into tears. Following the staff captain's example, many other cadets started sobbing, and the ranks of men began to break up. The voice of Radomes Mishlaevsky rose above the disorderly hubbub of noise. "Cadet Pavlovsky!" he barked at the bugler. "Sound the retreat!" "May I have permission, Colonel, to set fire to the school building?" asked Mishlaevsky, looking directly at the colonel. "No, you may not," Malyshev replied courteously and calmly. "Colonel, sir," Mishlaevsky said emotionally, "Petliura will get hold of the armaments store, the weapons, and most importantly," he added, pointing at the door into the vestibule where the head of Tsar Alexander could be seen rising above the stairwell. "Yes, he will," confirmed the colonel politely. "But then why, Colonel?" Malyshev turned to Mishlaevsky with a thoughtful look on his face. "Lieutenant," he said, "in 3 hours' time Petliura will be claiming the lives of hundreds of people, and my only regret will be that I will be unable to prevent their deaths by sacrificing my own life, as well as yours, far more valuable than mine, of course. I would ask you never to bring up the subject of the portraits, guns, and rifles again." "Colonel," Studzinski said, coming up to Malyshev, "on my own behalf, and also on behalf of the officers whom I incited to behave in that disgraceful fashion just now, I would ask you to accept our apologies." "Accepted," answered the colonel courteously. By the time the morning mist lying over the city had begun to disperse, the blunt-snouted mortars standing on the school square had had their breech blocks removed, and the rifles and machine guns, now smashed into pieces, had been flung into the recesses of the attic. Whole piles of shells had been tossed into holes dug in the snow, and into the hidey-holes of the cellars, and the lights in the assembly hall and the corridors had been extinguished. On Mishlaevsky's orders, the white switchboard had been smashed by cadets wielding their bayonets. Outside, the sky was now totally blue, and under the blue sky, Mishlaevsky and Karas, the two who had been the last to leave the school, stopped for a moment on the square to talk. "Did the commander warn Alexei?" Mishlaevsky asked Karas anxiously. "Of course he did. You could see for yourself that he wasn't around," answered Karas. "Will we be able to get to the Turbins this afternoon?" "No, that won't be possible while it's still light. There's lots to do, including hiding things away. Let's go back to the apartment." The sun was now shining in a blue sky. The mist was lifting and dispersing. Part 2. Chapter 8. Yes, there had been mist, together with needle-sharp frost, hoary coniferous branches, and snow, dark, moonless snow, falling just before daybreak. Beyond the city, in the distance, the blue cupolas of churches dotted with tinsel-like stars were visible, while on the far Moscow bank of the Dnieper, the illuminated cross on the top of the statue of St. Vladimir rose high into the fathomless sky, shining until dawn. With daybreak, the light on the cross went out, and the stars disappeared. But the day didn't brighten up especially, threatening to become rather grey. The Ukraine was covered with a low-lying layer of impenetrable cloud. In the village of Popelyucha, some 8 miles from the city, Colonel Kozyr awoke exactly at daybreak, with the meagre light trickling like sour milk through the narrow little window of his hut. His awakening coincided with the word position. It seemed at first that the word had simply appeared, as if part of a warm dream while he was fast asleep. He had even tried to brush it aside with his hand, as if it were cold to the touch. But the word expanded and made its presence felt in the hut, together with the crumpled envelope and the revolting red pimples on the face of his batman. Taking his mica map case to the window, he pulled out a map, found the village of Borhuni, then belly high, and started tracing with his fingernail along the network of roads dotted with little bushes on either side like flies, until he came to the huge black area denoting the city. In addition to the smell of the strong, cheap tobacco that Kozyr himself smoked, the room was filled with the reek of strong, low-grade tobacco from the possessor of the red pimples, who was under the assumption not only that he could smoke in Kozyr's presence, but also that he would not thereby be harming the war effort. Kozyr was faced with the immediate prospect of going into battle. Reacting cheerfully to the idea, he gave a huge yawn and buckled on the intricate harness, slinging the straps over his shoulder. He had slept that night in his greatcoat, not even removing his spurs. A peasant woman came bustling in with a jug of milk, but Kozyr never drank milk and wasn't about to start now. Some young children appeared from nowhere and started crawling about. One of them, the smallest with a completely naked behind, crawled along the shelf and clambered up to get hold of Kozyr's Mauser. But before he could get to it, Kozyr had already strapped it on. All his life up until 1914, Kozyr had been a village teacher. In that year he went to war with a regiment of dragoons, and by 1917 he had been commissioned. And now, at dawn on the 14th of December 1918, Kozyr found himself to be a colonel in Petliura's army, and nobody in the world, least of all Kozyr himself, could explain how this had happened. But it had happened because, for him, Kozyr, war was a vocation, whereas teaching had been a drawn-out and major mistake. This, however, can be a frequent occurrence in our lives. For 20 whole years, someone can be engaged in doing something or other, lecturing in Roman law, for example, and then suddenly, in the 21st year, it turns out that Roman law has become totally irrelevant, that it is a subject he neither understands nor likes, and that he is, in actual fact, a keen gardener with a passion for flowers. This happens, it might be supposed, because of the imperfections in the way in which society is organized, as a result of which people often find their true vocation only towards the end of their lives. Kozyr found his at the age of 45. Before then, he had been a poor teacher, tedious and cruel to his pupils. "Right, tell the lads to get outside and mount their horses," Kozyr said in Ukrainian, tightening the creaking straps around his waist. Smoke was rising above the white huts of Popelyucha as Colonel Kozyr's column of troops, about 400 sabres strong, rode out of the village. Wreaths of cheap tobacco smoke hung over the column, and Kozyr's 15-hand bay stallion trotted nervously under him. The baggage wagons creaked along, strung out for a few hundred yards behind the column. The men swayed in their saddles, and as soon as the regiment was out of Popelyucha, they unfurled a 2-coloured banner at the head of the column, one yellow strip and one blue strip, attached to a pole. Kozyr couldn't stand tea, preferring more than anything a measure of vodka in the morning. He loved imperial vodka, something that hadn't been around for 4 years, but that now, under the hetman, had become available throughout the Ukraine. The vodka poured from Kozyr's grey flask, and into his veins like a hot flame. It ran, too, through the veins of his men, poured from mess tins obtained from a store in Belaya Tserkov, and once it had taken effect, a 3-sectioned accordion struck up at the head of the column, and someone started singing in a falsetto voice, "Oh, the woods, the forests of green, that stretch as far as the eye can see," the song being taken up by the basses in the 5th row. The young girl was ploughing the field with a strong black ox that refused to yield, and when the ox, oh the ox, went its own way, she asked a Cossack on his fiddle to play. The trooper carrying the banner started whistling happily like a nightingale and cracking his whip. Lances and black-braided and black-tasselled fur caps swayed along in time with the singing. Snow crunched under 1,000 iron-shod hooves. A tapping drum added to the general sense of merriment. "That's it, lads! Keep your spirits up!" Kozier shouted approvingly as the nightingale song soared up over the snow-covered Ukrainian fields. When they had passed through Belly High, the mist lifted. All the roads were black with troops, the snow crunching underfoot as they marched along. At a crossroads near High, they allowed a 1,500-strong group of infantrymen to go ahead of them. The men in the front ranks, all from Galicia, were wearing identical dark blue jerkins made from good-quality German cloth, and their faces were more refined and mobile than Kozier's troopers. The men towards the rear were wearing long hospital gowns reaching down to their ankles, with yellow leather belts tied round the waist. On their heads, bobbing above their fur caps, they all wore battered German helmets. Their metal-soled boots pounded the snow beneath them. All this activity had turned the snow on the roads leading to the city black. "Hurrah!" cheered the infantrymen as they marched past the blue and yellow banner. "Hurrah!" echoed the woods around High. The cheers were answered by gunfire on their left flank and to the rear. During the night, the commander of the besieging forces, Colonel Toropets, had sent 2 batteries to take up their positions in the city park. The snow-covered pine trees, tall and straight as masts, awoke to the thunderous sound of waves of 6-inch shells. 2 rounds landed near the large settlement of Pushcha Voditsa, shattering all the glass in the windows of 4 snowbound houses. Several pine trees were reduced to splinters, sending fountains of snow cascading many yards into the air. But then the gunfire in Pushcha died down. The forest stood there, once again half asleep. Only the alarmed squirrels scurried and clawed their way up and down the 100-year-old tree trunks. The 2 gun batteries were transferred from their position near Pushcha to the right flank. They moved across the seemingly endless ploughed fields, then through the wooded area around Urochische, and turned down a narrow path until they reached a fork in the road, where they stopped and deployed, now within sight of the city. Then, in the early hours of the morning, they started shelling Podgorodnaya, Savskaya, and the city suburb of Korenyovka with high-bursting shrapnel. In the low-lying snowy sky there was a rattling sound, as if someone were playing on a musical instrument. The inhabitants had been sheltering in their cellars since early morning, and in the half-light of dawn, frozen groups of cadets could be seen making their way towards the centre of the city. The gunfire, however, soon ceased, to be replaced by the animated crackle of small-arms fire somewhere on the outskirts to the north of the city. Then that, too, fell silent. The train carrying the commander of the troops besieging the city, Colonel Toropets, stood at a small station somewhere deep in the forests, about 2 miles from the snowbound, deserted village of Sviatoshin, still reeling from the deafening crash and thunder of gunfire. Throughout the night, the electric light had been burning in all 6 carriages, and the station telephone, as well as the field telephones in Toropets's grimy compartment, had never stopped squawking. As soon as the snowy landscape outside had emerged into the full light of day, the guns farther up the line from Sviatoshin to Postvolinsky started thundering away, and the little birds in the yellow receivers burst into song once again. "We've taken Sviatoshin," the thin, nervous Toropets informed his adjutant, Khudyukovsky. "Find out, if you please, whether we can now move up to it." Toropets's train slowly started to move between the walls of tall, snow-covered trees, stopping close to where the railway line was crossed by a major road that pointed like an arrow straight into the heart of the city. Here, in his compartment, Toropets began to carry out the plan that he had devised over 2 sleepless nights in this self-same bug-ridden carriage, number 4173. Shrouded in mist, the city was surrounded on all sides. To the north, forest and ploughed fields. To the west, the captured village of Sviatoshin. To the southwest, the ill-fated Postvolinsky. And to the south, where the railway line bordered the woods, there were cemeteries, pastures, and a shooting range. And there was cavalry on the move everywhere, the horses' harnesses jingling as they crept in a black tide along the tracks and railway lines, or advanced unhindered across the snowy plains. The heavy gun carts creaked, while Petliura's infantry, worn out by a whole month of hanging about in reserve, became bogged down in the snow. In the apartment of Toropets's train, with its scuffed cloth floor, the telephone trilled incessantly, and the operators Franco and Harras, not having had a wink's sleep all night, began to fool about, making silly noises over the phone. Toropets's plan was a cunning one, just as he himself, the black-browed, clean-shaven, nervous Colonel Toropets, was a cunning man. It was not for nothing that he had posted 2 gun batteries close to the city's forest. Nor was it for nothing that his shells had crashed through the frosty air to destroy the tram line in the shabby village of Puszcza. Neither was it a coincidence that he had then moved his machine guns across from the ploughed fields to a position where they would be closer to the army's left flank. Toropets wanted to pull the wool across the eyes of those defending the city by pretending that he would be taking the city from the springboard of his, Toropets's, left flank, that is, from the north, and from the suburb of Kurinyovka, thereby drawing their army over in that direction. In actual fact, however, he would be striking right at the heart of the city, by moving directly from Sviatoshin along the Brest-Litovsk highway, as well as by thrusting forward from the extreme right flank in the south, from the village of Demiyevka. And so, in accordance with Toropets's plan, elements of Petliura's army moving along the roads made their way across from the left flank to the right. Among them were the black-capped troopers of Kozieleshka's regiment, marching with the NCOs in the lead to the accompaniment of pipes and accordion. "Hurrah!" echoed the woods around High. "Hurrah!" Advancing, they left High behind them and crossed the railway line by a wooden bridge, where they came within sight of the city. The city was still warm from sleep, and the sky was wreathed either in mist or smoke. Standing up on his stirrups and looking through his Zeiss binoculars, Kozia could see the roofs of the huge multi-story buildings and the cupola of the ancient St. Sophia Cathedral. On Kozia's right flank, fighting was already underway. Less than a mile away, he could hear the metallic crash of heavy guns and the rattle of machine-gun fire. Detachments of Petliura's infantry could be seen dashing across in the direction of Postvolinsky, while uncoordinated and assorted detachments of White Guard infantry, stunned by the intense shelling, were falling back from Post. The city. Low, cloud-covered sky, a street corner, houses to one side, the occasional greatcoat. "It's just been announced that there's been some sort of agreement with Petlura to allow all armed Russian troops to leave the city and join Denikin on the Don." "Well, and?" The crash and thunder of gunfire, the whine of a machine gun. Despairing, baffled cadet's voice. "But doesn't that mean we'll have to stop resisting?" Despondent cadet's voice. "Who the devil knows?" Colonel Shetkin hadn't been at Army headquarters that morning, for the very simple reason that the headquarters no longer existed. On the night of the 14th of December, it had left for City Passenger Railway Station No. 1, spending the night at the Hotel Rose of Stamboul, right next to the telegraph office. There, Shetkin's telephone had trilled once or twice during the night, but by morning it had fallen silent. And that morning, 2 of Colonel Shetkin's adjutants vanished without trace. An hour later, after rummaging around in boxes full of papers and tearing some documents into shreds, Shetkin himself left the grubby Rose, no longer in his grey greatcoat with epaulets, but in a civilian fur coat and a pork-pie hat. Where they had come from, no one had any idea. Taking a cab 1 block away from the Rose, Shetkin went to a small but well-furnished apartment in Lipki, rang the bell, kissed a generously proportioned golden-haired woman, and retired with her to a secluded bedroom. Her eyes widened in shock as he looked directly into them and whispered, "That's it. It's all over." "I'm exhausted," he said, and went behind an alcove where he fell asleep after drinking a cup of black coffee prepared for him by the hands of the golden-haired lady. The cadets of the 1st Infantry Detachment knew nothing about any of this, and this was a pity. Had they known, their desire to fight would have been diminished, and instead of stumbling about under a shrapnel-torn sky at Postvolinsky, they would have made their way to that cosy little apartment in Lipki, seized Colonel Stetkin, dragged him outside, and hanged him from the nearest lamp-post right opposite the golden-haired woman's apartment. Had they done this, it would have been really good. But they didn't do it, because they didn't know or understand anything that was going on. And indeed, nobody understood anything about what was happening in the city, and it was quite likely that it would be a long time before anyone did understand. There were still some metal-helmeted Germans in the city, although it is true they were somewhat demoralized. Maybe the foxy hetman, too, with his trimmed moustache, was still there. Only very few people knew about the wounding of the mysterious Major von Schratt in the neck that morning. Possibly also His Excellency Prince Belorukov and General Kartusov, responsible for setting up detachments charged with the defense of the mother of Russian cities. The headquarters telephones were still trilling, although nobody was yet aware that since early morning these very same headquarters had begun to melt away. In general, however, the city was full of military men. There was real anger in the city whenever Petliura's name was mentioned, and he was still being mocked by dissolute St. Petersburg journalists in that morning's edition of the News. While cadets were walking around inside the city, out there in the suburbs, the whistle of Petliura's approaching black-capped cavalry could already be heard, together with the high-spirited Ukrainian Cossacks, as they moved jauntily across from the army's left flank to the right. And if their whistling could be heard only a couple of miles away, then what hope was there for the hetman? And the whistling meant they were coming to get him. Maybe the Germans would come to his rescue. But then, why were those stolid Germans just sitting around at Fastov station, grinning apathetically into their clipped German moustaches as unit after unit of Petliura's army passed them on their way to the city? Perhaps there had been some agreement with Petlura to allow him to enter the city peacefully. But if so, why the hell should the white officer's guns still be firing at him? No, nobody will ever understand what was going on in the city during the afternoon of the 14th of December. The headquarters telephones were still trilling away, albeit, it is true, less and less often. Less often. Now, only occasionally. Ring! What's going on? Ring! More ammunition to Colonel Stepanov, Ivanov, Antonov, Stratonov. We should go to the Don, lads, immediately. Nothing's going right here, damn it. Ring! To hell with those bastards at HQ. To the Don! The telephones rang less and less often. By midday, they had all but stopped. All around the city, now in one place, now in another, there was the intermittent thunder of gunfire. But despite all the noise, life in the city at midday continued much as normal. The shops were open and trading as usual. The pavements were filled with a mass of scurrying pedestrians. Doors slammed, and the trams continued to run along the streets, their bells ringing. But then, at midday, there was a lively burst of machine-gun fire from the Pyechersk region of the city. The Pyechersk hills echoed to the staccato rattle that could be heard as far away as the city centre. My goodness, that was a bit close, wasn't it? What's going on? Passers-by stopped and began to sniff the air. Immediately, there were noticeably fewer people on some of the pavements. What? Who? Rat-a-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, at-a-tat, ta-ta. Who's that firing, then? What do you mean, who? Don't you know? That's Colonel Bolbotun. So, he'd rebelled against Petlura, had he? Tired of attempting to carry out Colonel Tarapietzi's complicated staff plan, Colonel Bolbotun had decided to speed things up. His cavalry had been frozen, just hanging around behind the cemetery in the very south of the city, where it was only a stone's throw to the wise, ancient, snow-covered Dnieper, And Bolbotun had been frozen too, so with a flourish of his whip he had sent his regiment moving off in threes, spreading out along the road and onto the railway line, hugging the edge of the city. Here Bolbotun met with no resistance. 6 of his machine guns started firing with such force that the sound crashed like thunder around the entire low-lying wooded area near Nizhnaya Telichka. In a flash, Bolbotun cut off the railway line, halting a passenger train which had just crossed the bridge over the Dnieper, bringing a fresh consignment of Muscovites and Petersburgers with their chic women and long-haired dogs. Everyone went crazy with fear, but just at that moment, Bolbotun was too busy to be concerned with dogs. Accompanied by the whistle of shunting engines, the alarmed empty goods wagons moved from the freight depot to the passenger station, and Bolbotun's men sent a hail of bullets crashing onto the roofs of houses on Sviatotroitskaya Street. Bolbotun continued on into the city and along the street, making unimpeded progress as far as the military academy, where he sent his cavalry on ahead to scout along every little alleyway. It wasn't until he reached the peeling columns of the Nikolaev Academy that he came up against his first opposition. Here he was met by machine gun and ragged rifle fire from isolated units. One of the Cossacks in the forward troop of the leading squadron, Butsenko, was killed. 5 men were wounded, and 2 horses had their legs shattered. As a result, Bolbotun's progress was for a time delayed. He imagined, mistakenly, that he was confronted by unknown numbers of the enemy, whereas in actual fact the blue-capped colonel was faced by only 30 cadets, with 4 officers and 1 machine gun. Bolbotun quickly ordered his columns to dismount, take cover, and return the cadets' fire. The whole Pyachersk region was filled with the sound of gunfire echoing along the walls of the buildings. In the area of Millionaya Street, everything came rapidly to the boil. The effect of Bolbotun's incursion into the city was immediate. The metal shutters in the shops lining Yelisavetinskaya, Vinogradnaya, and Levashovskaya streets came crashing down. The brightly lit shop windows went dark, and the pavements immediately emptied, becoming strangely resonant. Caretakers hastily closed gates. The effect of Bolbotun's advance was also felt in the city centre. The trilling of the field telephones at army headquarters began to fall silent. A gun battery telephones its headquarters. No answer, damn it. An infantry detachment telephones its commanding officer and manages to get through to someone, but the voice at the other end just mutters some incoherent nonsense. "Are your officers still wearing epaulets?" "What's that?" "Ring, ring. Send a detachment to Pyachersk immediately." "What's that?" "Ring." The name Bolbotun crept from street to street. Bolbotun. Bolbotun. How did people know that it was definitely Bolbotun and not someone else? The answer was not clear, but there was no doubt that people knew. Perhaps they knew it was Bolbotun because from midday onwards certain people wearing coats with lambskin collars began to mix with pedestrians and the usual city types lounging around. These people were everywhere, darting in and out of the crowd. They would fix cadets and gold-braided officers with long, lingering stares and begin to whisper. "Bolbotun's in town," they would say, without any note of sadness in their voice. On the contrary, their eyes showed just how happy they were at the idea. "Hurrah!" they seemed to be saying. "Hurrah!" came the echo from the hills around Pyachersk. This was the signal for all kinds of nonsense. "Bolbotun is Grand Prince Mikhail Alexandrovich." "Not at all. Bolbotun is actually Grand Prince Nikolai Nikolaevich." "No, Bolbotun's simply Bolbotun." "There'll be a Jewish pogrom." "No, there won't. Just the opposite. They're wearing red ribbons." "We better get home quickly." "Bolbotun is against Petlura." "No, he's not. He's for the Bolsheviks." "Quite the opposite. He's for the Tsar, but without any officers." "The hetman's gone, hasn't he?" "Surely not. Really? Really?" Ring, ring. A Bolbotun reconnaissance group led by Cossack Lieutenant Galanba was trotting down a totally empty Millionaya Street. Then, suddenly, can you imagine it? A door opens, and none other than the famous army contractor Yakov Grigorievich Feldman comes dashing out and makes straight for the 5 mounted Cossack troopers. Have you taken leave of your senses, Yakov Grigorievich, that you should even think it necessary to come running out at such a time when such things are going on? And certainly, Yakov Grigorievich had the expression of someone who has taken leave of his senses. His hat had toppled onto the back of his head, his coat was unbuttoned, and his eyes were rolling all over the place. Yakov Grigorievich Feldman had good cause to go out of his mind. The moment the gunfire had started in the vicinity of the military academy, he had heard a groan coming from his wife's lovely little bedroom. Another groan followed. Then silence. "Oy vey," Yakov Grigorievich said in response to the groan. He looked out of the window and convinced himself that things were not good at all. Nothing but empty streets and gunfire. But then the groaning increased in volume, cutting through his heart like a knife. His round-shouldered old mother poked her head round the bedroom door and shouted, "Yasha, it's begun! Do you understand?" And Yakov Grigorievich's thoughts focused immediately on one place, the corner house at the very end of Millionaya Street, next to the patch of waste ground, where there was a small, rusty sign announcing in gold letters, "Midwife, E.T. Shadurskaya." Although Millionaya Street wasn't a major road, it wasn't particularly safe. People were firing along it from Pyachersk Square towards the upper part of the city. Just make it there. That's all he wants to do. With his hat on the back of his head, his eyes bulging with terror, Yakov Grigorievich Feldman slinks along the wall. "Halt! Where do you think you're going?" Galamba leant down from his saddle. Feldman stood there, his face black as thunder, his eyes rolling, as he noticed the green Cossack ribbons on their caps. "I'm just a peaceful citizen, sir. My wife's giving birth, and I need the midwife." "The midwife, you say? So why are you skulking about by the wall, you horrible little yid?" "Sir, Feldman felt the sergeant's whip curl like a snake round his fur collar and his neck. He screamed out from the hellish pain, and his face, no longer black as thunder, turned white. As he stared at the Cossack's tassels, he had a sudden mental image of his wife. "Papers!" Feldman pulled out his document wallet, opened it, and took out the first piece of paper. But as soon as he had done so, he started trembling. He'd suddenly remembered something. Oh, God, what had he done? Why on earth had he taken out that piece of paper? But how could he possibly be worried about such trivial matters while dashing out of the house with his wife in labour? Oh, woe to Feldman. Sergeant Galamba grabbed at the document immediately. It was just a small piece of paper with a stamp. But for Feldman, it meant death. "The holder of this pass, Yakov Grigorievich Feldman, is hereby permitted to enter and leave the city freely for the purposes of supplying the armoured units of the city garrison with equipment, and to move freely about the city after 12 midnight. Signed, Quartermaster General Major General Illarionov, Adjutant Lieutenant Leshchinsky." Feldman's job was to supply General Kartusov with lard, together with petroleum jelly for greasing his artillery pieces. Please, God, let there be a miracle. "But, sir, that's the wrong document. Please—" "No, it's the right document," said Galamba, grinning evilly. "Don't worry, we can read it for ourselves." "Please, God, let there be a miracle. You can have 11,000 rubles, take it all, but just let me live, just let me live. Shema Yisrael." But no miracle was forthcoming, and it was as well for Feldman that he died an easy death. Sergeant Galamba had no time to waste, and so, with just a single downward sweep of his sabre, he sliced through Feldman's head.